Welcome back, everyone. John Collins with you again for what is our final episode of the season. My goodness, 2025 has been a really, dare I say, interesting year, but also a very eye-opening year for a wide variety of reasons. We had a new presidential administration take office in January. We witnessed the assassination of a high-profile political activist in Utah with the death of Charlie Kirk not too long ago. Our federal government went through the longest shutdown in its history until Congress and the president opened it back up, at least for now, as the legislation, as it seems, will likely only keep the government open into January, but we'll see. So who knows what will happen then. On top of that, I'm absolutely convinced, and you probably are too, that social media continues to make everything look 20 times worse than it really is. These days, it's really easy to develop a sky is falling mindset that makes it difficult to stay focused, to stay optimistic, and to stay energized. But in reality, um, the good news is that the world is not ending. And that also happens to be exactly the title of our workshop at the International Symposium on Human Identification last week, 2 weeks ago, excuse me, in West Palm Beach, Florida. If you've been listening to our show, you already knew that. And I'm also really happy for our friends and colleagues at Promega, our season sponsor for 2025, and the perennial host of Ishi, who again did a great job putting together an outstanding event with an outstanding program. Ishi is the largest professional conference dedicated entirely to supporting the practice, the application, and research of forensic DNA evidence in our criminal justice system. And it's truly been one of the highlights of my career to have developed such strong relationships with the Ishi organizers, as well as my good friends and colleagues, Pam Marshall, Julie Sikorsky, and Ray Wickenheiser. Together, we make up the new Ishi, what's called the Forensic Leadership Alliance, in which we work together to support the development of leaders and influencers, excuse me, in the forensic DNA community. One of the things that we did a couple of weeks ago at Ishi on Monday of the symposium was provide one-on-one coaching sessions for some of the attendees. I found that to be very rewarding. And I was also reminded, as I am quite frequently, that coaching's not easy, neither for the client or for the coach, nor should it be. And it is not a skill that is easily developed for people that want to become coaches. Contrary to what many people think, coaching is not the giving of advice per se, or telling people what they should do. And it isn't necessarily about encouraging people or making them feel good, although encouragement is certainly a big part of it, especially when people have really taken a hit to their confidence and need someone to help them get back on their feet. A coaching session is certainly a great place to do that. But what makes coaching challenging is that when you do it right, when you do it the way that it's supposed to be done, you're helping people become better thinkers. And as their thinking improves, their decisions, their actions, their behaviors, and their overall outlook on their lives and their careers improve as well. Now, there are a lot of people out there, and I see them almost every day with their posts on social media platforms, who've given themselves the title of coach. Anybody can do that. And they describe themselves that way, but it's easy to tell that many of them don't actually understand what coaching is. And because of that, they can unintentionally have an adverse impact on their clients because the coach makes it about the coach and what the coach wants to say rather than being deliberate and creative in helping the client think and develop better thinking habits. And that's not easy to do. So I really enjoyed, as I always do, the opportunity to work with Pam, Julie, and Ray and do some free coaching sessions there at the Ishi Symposium. And I want to thank personally and very sincerely the team at Promega and all of the Ishi organizers for arranging a coaching room for us there at the symposium site that we could use, and for allowing us to engage with attendees in that capacity. It was really a lot of fun. And you, by the way, you can start looking forward to next year's event, which reportedly will be in Providence, Rhode Island at the Rhode Island Convention Center. And that will run from October 26th to the 29th of next year. So make sure you hold on to those dates, and I definitely look forward to seeing you there. So today I want to explore a topic with you that has been on my mind as I come close to finishing the manuscript for my next book, which is Valid Comparisons, the Forensic and Judicial Interpretation of Stochastic Patterns. This has been a very challenging but also deeply enriching project because, as I think most authors can understand, you learn so much from the research that you have to do when you're writing a book with this much subject matter depth and in a highly specialized field. And this one certainly has been no exception. One of the topics I was more or less forced to confront was the standardization movement in general and within the forensic science community more specifically. And indeed, the standardization movement goes far beyond forensic science. Standardization is part of a new, well, I don't like the term new world order, which I think is thrown around a little bit too loosely, in my opinion, but I would describe it as a new global integration. And in many cases, standardization is absolutely vital, particularly for economic growth, where economic growth is needed or lacking. When you standardize the way products are designed, for example, you make it easier for entrepreneurs to start businesses and invest in product development because they have predictable specifications to rely on. It lowers their risk and allows the magic of capitalism to drive business growth and bring valuable products to market more efficiently. Now, I love history. I think it's so important to understand history if we are to fully understand what's going on right now and how current events that we're dealing with right now actually came about. So ISO, which is the International Organization for Standardization. ISO is actually not an acronym or an abbreviation, but it's actually the Greek word meaning equal. ISO is the flagship, as many of you know, particularly those of you in forensic science, of the international standardization movement. And it was created in 1947 after the end of World War II. And that had a specific benefit and a specific purpose. And although in forensic science we think of ISO and ISO-based accreditation standards as being for the purpose of quality, it had very little to do with quality, at least not as a primary objective. The primary objective of ISO was the reconstruction of global trade after the war, which was especially devastating to Europe, which started to see and recognize how its fragmentation and its division into small individual countries had made it so vulnerable to attack. Now, 4 years later, this was in 1951, a new organization and a very important organization called the European Coal and Steel Community was created and began. To a large degree, what we would call the acceleration of this transformation of Europe into a more cohesive economic and military power. And so the creation of ISO in 1947 helped to, how would we say this? It helped to cultivate the mindset that European integration and European unification was possible. And it was this mindset that perhaps brought about the Treaty of Rome in 1957, which formally established the concept of the European Economic Community and later what became the European Union. But if goods, services, and people and capital or money were to start moving freely across borders, which would be absolutely necessary for the unification of Europe, then national differences in rules and regulations and technical specifications had to be eliminated as much as possible because they would become obstacles to the post-war unification effort. So standardization, whether it be technical, procedural, regulatory, or whatever, became a necessary tool in this integration of Europe, and it worked. And not only did it unite and strengthen a continent that was quite fractured, it also played a significant role in opening the world's eyes to how standardization can have a unifying effect where there is disunity. It can create strength where there is weakness. So it's really important for us to grasp that standardization wasn't primarily about quality or safety or controlling how specific industries or occupations conduct themselves. It was about unification, strength, and the elimination of barriers. In fact, one of my workshops, this is the Professional Orientation School for New Forensic Scientists, one of my online training programs. We use the example of a light switch to make this point, like the ones in your house. Light switches are manufactured according to standardized specifications. You can, go to Home Depot or Lowe's and you'll see dozens of different kinds of switches and boxes and face plates. They're all standardized. All can be installed in your home. And if you didn't have those specifications, you'd have to custom build every single light switch from scratch at enormous cost. Even installation and repairs would be far less efficient and more costly. And as we know, standardization is especially vital in occupations where safety is a significant concern or where work quality must be tightly controlled. Many products require very precise tolerances, and standardization helps establish and memorialize those tolerances at scale. But the primary driver of standardization, historically speaking, was economic strength, military strength, and political unity. So in the field of forensic science, like many of you, I've been fortunate to witness a lot of historically significant developments, not the least of which was the scaling up and maturity of forensic DNA testing and forensic DNA databasing. Digital forensics also came of age during this time and is still coming of age, quite frankly. And in my opinion, and I've talked about this before in different venues, the efforts that forensic laboratory administrators made in the late 1970s and the early 1980s to create standards for the management of crime laboratories were absolutely vital in ushering in, if you will, a new evolutionary phase in the history of forensic science. There's simply no doubt about it. Before these accreditation standards were created, there was very little consistency in how laboratories, their people, and their processes were managed. That meant it was almost impossible to judge how well a laboratory was performing because there was no standard against which to measure it. There was no unity. And that lack of unity was correctly seen as a major vulnerability, and it was. And had it not been for the accreditation standards and the accreditation culture that emerged in the early 1980s, I believe forensic DNA profiling would have had a much more difficult time scaling up. But as we examine our current climate in forensic science and the criminal justice system more broadly, something may be happening in the profession of forensic science right now that is not good. And from what I can tell, it is something that needs to be talked about. And I hope this episode might spark some needed conversations in the places and in the circles where conversations are desperately needed, in my opinion. So for what it's worth, and based on my own recent and past experiences coaching forensic laboratory scientists and administrators all over the country and some overseas, talking with workshop participants and interacting with my colleagues and clients in the forensic science field, we need to start being alert to the very real possibility that we are either dangerously close to or have already crossed the threshold where we are standardizing the profession of forensic science into a state of paralysis. It might be that in our efforts to prove ourselves worthy of respect or to appease our critics, that we are in fact standardizing the soul out of forensic science. And I'll explain what I mean by that in just a bit. But we should first acknowledge that if this is true, which I fear that it is, we would not be the first occupation to run into this problem. Education and medicine here in the United States are two really good examples. So let's take education first. There's long been a push to standardize curriculum and assessments in American education, and this has been going on for decades, and it began with good intentions, which was to reduce variability between classrooms or across classrooms. It was to ensure that every child had access to, I guess, what we would call foundational or basic knowledge, and also to give policymakers better visibility or awareness into how schools were performing. And those objectives, I think, are quite reasonable, as long as they don't become abusive or counterproductive. But what's too often happening in the classroom setting is far more complicated and not what was envisioned. Teachers began eventually reporting a steady decline or erosion of their professional autonomy and their love of their work, an erosion of their or reporting their inability or their hesitation to exercise professional judgment, which is to adapt, let's say, lessons to the students that are right there in front of them, and to bring creativity into the learning environment when that creativity enhances the learning experience for students. But many teachers now say they feel less like educators and more like technicians. And in too many instances, the result has been a plummeting of job satisfaction among teachers, increase in burnout, and entire school systems becoming dependent on very rigid procedures that stifle the very instincts that great teachers and their students rely upon. The work became more controlled, but did not necessarily become more valuable. And we can pass this on, or we can expand this discussion into medicine. Medicine has also wrestled with a similar problem when it comes to standardization. And look how expensive medicine has become. Evidence-based guidelines, strict clinical procedures, and standardized checklists have unquestionably improved patient safety and reduced preventable errors. One of my favorite authors, Atul Gawande, wrote a book. In fact, it's on my bookshelf in my office. Wrote a book called The Checklist Manifesto, which I highly recommend, in which he writes about how checklists helped to revolutionize the practice of medicine and the dramatic reduction of errors, particularly in the operating room, and infections. But doctors and nurses also report some unintended consequences in specific instances, feeling constrained by protocols that don't always match the nuance of a real patient's condition, or fearing legal liability when exercising judgment outside of a guideline, and experiencing what might be described as a subtle but demoralizing shift from being trusted professionals to being monitored workers who now have to defensively document every decision they make and action that they take. In some healthcare systems, compliance and metrics rather than the science behind them have become the defining feature of the work. So standardization, when it's implemented in good faith and in the right way, has the effect of supporting and amplifying the positive impact of professional expertise. But in practice, it often competes with it. And look how expensive medicine has become. It's crippling families and forcing many citizens to forego health insurance altogether because they simply can't afford it. In forensic science, we need to prioritize smart decision-making over trendy decision-making. Standardization is very trendy right now, but there are reasons to believe that it's gone too far. And let me share a recent example. I just the other day, I saw a post on my LinkedIn feed about a new crime scene standard that reportedly came from the American Academy of Forensic Sciences Standards Board. And I thought to myself, okay, this is interesting. So I opened it. I used to teach a graduate level university crime scene course. So this is sort of up my alley. And when I read it, it was about the most underwhelming document I could imagine. It looked like a document produced by a committee where a bunch of smart people come with their own ideas about how things should be done, and in order to appease everyone on the committee, the final product ends up saying almost nothing. And the fact that anyone would actually take pride in this document, at least from my humble perspective, borders on the embarrassing. In my opinion, this is a perfect example of standardization out of place. Standardization pushed too far. I mean, think about it. Standardization is needed where it is unlikely to emerge on its own or to be taken seriously on its own. But when it comes to crime scene response, I mean, how many textbooks and training courses and procedures exist on crime scene response? Countless. And we're talking about great textbooks, great training courses, well-developed procedures written, provided by outstanding experienced practitioners who are willing to share their knowledge and put it into practice. That is the standard. And when you have that, and we do in crime scene response and many other forensic disciplines, these are domains of expertise with a long history of developing standards of practice and memorializing them in literature and training programs and standing operating procedures. Forensic science is an expertise-based occupation. And as an expertise-based occupation, it requires decision-making, creativity, and reflection. And experience helps a lot too. Every crime scene is unique. Every victim is unique. Every perpetrator is unique. You cannot standardize those conditions in a single document that makes the members of a committee all happy with themselves and have it actually be useful. They need to be established through channels of communication and channels of publication where nuance and complexity are allowed to shape how the work is done. And when you fail to do that, you end up with a document like the one I read. Never in a million years would I have assigned that standard or that document to my crime scene students as required reading. I'd much rather they refer to the textbooks and the journal articles that are out there, which have already established the standards of practice. And to me, it's disappointingly arrogant. I'm sorry to say this, to ignore meaningful, long-established standards of practice in the peer-reviewed literature and training programs and well-documented procedures that have existed for decades and continue to improve and evolve, and somehow imagine that a committee can sit down and write the real standard. I mean, come on, that is not how our profession works. And we have to stop acting like it is. In my new book, Valid Comparisons, which I'm hoping will be out by March, I hope, that's my goal, I discuss what I call the Daubert contagion. The Daubert contagion was the rapid spread of misinformation about the 1993 Daubert ruling. There are two parts I'll mention here to the Daubert contagion. The first is the characterization of Daubert as a standard. the Daubert standard. I'm sure you've heard that term. There is no such thing. There is no such thing as a Daubert standard. The criteria laid out by the Supreme Court were guidelines, things judges could opt to consider when evaluating expert testimony. Guidelines, recommendations, not a standard. The second problem was the claim that a scientific technique must have a known rate of error to be considered valid. This was a monumentally erroneous claim about science. Now, that is not to say forensic disciplines or other disciplines cannot benefit from research that produces some scientifically robust rates of error that help to understand reliability or trustworthiness. But to claim that known error rates are required to establish scientific validity is absolute nonsense. During my research for valid comparisons, I had multiple conversations with people who had a front row seat to the development of the 2009 National Academy of Sciences report. Something that I believe, which was the reason for my research, I believe was heavily compromised by the Daubert contagion. And what I came away with from these conversations, and I'm very grateful, by the way, to those who spoke with me, but what I came away with was that some committee members had already decided how they wanted to characterize the forensic laboratory sciences before the work even began. As one individual told me, they were not going to let the facts get in the way of their conclusions. The seating of the committee, the deliberations, and the final report were profoundly influenced by activists in the Innocence Network and other justice reform advocates who desperately wanted and needed to characterize forensic science as unreliable. There's simply no question about it. And the reason these activists had so much sway in Washington at the time was because just a couple of years before the NAS report came out in 2007, I talked about this in a previous episode. The Innocence Project in Manhattan published a report that was titled 200 Exonerations, Too Many Wrongfully Convicted. And in that report, they claimed that out of the first 200 DNA exonerations, 65% were convicted during the original trial based at least in part on fraudulent, unreliable, or limited forensic science. That's the exact wording in the report. And that would make bad forensic science the second leading cause of wrongful convictions, according to the Innocence Project's data. Now, when my colleague Jay Jarvis and I published our article, The Wrongful Conviction of Forensic Science, in 2009, we used the Innocence Project's own data to show that this claim was wildly incorrect. It wasn't even close. And it was this flawed claim combined with the Daubert contagion that ultimately corrupted the NAS Forensic Science Committee and its final report. The fact that the 2009 NAS report on forensic science, Strengthening Forensic Science in the United States, A Path Forward, which is its actual title, the fact that it's still treated as an authoritative document is frankly mind-boggling and unacceptable. And I'm not even going to go into the PCAST report, which was even worse, and for very similar reasons. So to bring this back to standardization, the standardization movement in forensic science has been underwritten by significant federal funding. One of the most compelling reasons that Congress has been willing to authorize that funding is this erroneous notion that forensic science is a leading cause of wrongful convictions. And it is not. And as I mentioned in my book, 50 Situations Awaiting Every Forensic Scientist, you can make a very strong case, a very confident case, that forensic science is one of, and perhaps the greatest preventers of wrongful convictions. In other words, if you removed forensic science from the criminal justice system, the system as we know it would collapse, and the number of injustices, the number of erroneous convictions would skyrocket. That is so easy to demonstrate as being true. Now, you may recall that some time ago, I had Mark Stollerow from NIST on my show. I have a lot of respect and appreciation for the work that Mark has done and for the work that NIST has done. But I do think, having given this a lot of reflection in the last couple of months as I'm completing this manuscript, I do think we need serious conversations about what we're actually trying to do, what we're spending our money on, and how certain standardization efforts or the ways in which standardization efforts are impacting morale and job satisfaction among forensic science practitioners out there, the people that are working in our laboratories. We need to think critically about standardization at the same time that we advocate for it. And we can do both. Maybe we have to do both, but let me put it this way. The accreditation of forensic science laboratories was a positive development because it helped administrators think more clearly. But we also have to be concerned that standardization may now be taking away the incentive for qualified forensic experts to think, to innovate, to be creative, to notice things, to make decisions based on the conclusions they see at a crime scene or in the evidence itself. If we take forensic science too far down the road, where thinking, I should say nuance or complex and creative thinking, are no longer key parts of the practice, it will be extremely difficult to attract professionals who can think and who want to think. There's simply no question that good people, good scientists do not want to work in a field where they aren't allowed to think or where they are afraid to think. You remember the education example that I gave a moment ago? Well, multiple studies show that teacher autonomy is strongly associated with job satisfaction. When teachers feel that they have discretion over methods, classroom management, and the pacing of lessons, their satisfaction goes up. But when they feel constrained by highly standardized curricula and testing, it goes down. In fact, a 2003 study on mathematics teachers, mathematics teachers found that greater autonomy improved both teacher well-being and student outcomes. In other words, over-standardization doesn't just hurt teachers, it hurts the results. And the same is true in healthcare. There was even an interesting study from schools in Ghana showing that while standardization can help with consistency, it can undermine autonomy and reduce responsiveness to student needs when implemented too rigidly. And again, as we see in medicine, although there's a lot of good reasons to standardize the manufacturing of devices and establishing the tolerances of these surgical devices, these scanning devices, as we standardize the way that doctors engage with patients and the way that nurses engage with patients, we can risk taking the humanity out of it. And when the humanity comes out of it, it will decline. And there's just so many examples of that. When you remove the humanity from a practice, it deteriorates. So if we were to distill this down to one question for the forensic science profession, it would be this: Are we maintaining the right cultural balance right now between ensuring quality, being responsive to stakeholders, and creating a field where highly competent, critically thinking professionals actually want to build a career? Or are we standardizing the soul out of forensic science? Well, we're seeing increasing burnout, that's for sure. Mental health concerns, young professionals who who entered the field believing it offered opportunities to grow and blossom that are now looking for ways out. It's not what they thought it was. This was a subject that came up at the Issue Symposium a couple of weeks ago. We need a reckoning, and I think we need it right now. And by the way, this may sound cynical, and I'm not cynical by nature, and those of you that know me know that I'm not. But I do fear that there are some individuals who are driving the standardization movement who may be enjoying themselves a bit too much. As Abraham Maslow, the great positive psychologist who passed away in the year that I was born in 1970, it feels good to be relevant. It feels good to lead a profession. It feels good to sit in rooms where policy is made, to set standards and to rub elbows with policymakers in Washington, D.C. And for those out there who do this, I'm happy for them, but that's not the goal. We have to think about the practitioners at the workbench and the value that they deliver to our criminal justice system. How is all of this affecting them? How is it affecting their morale, their enthusiasm, their sense of purpose? How is it affecting investigators in the field? How is it affecting the attractiveness of a forensic science career to the top-notch college graduates that we want to recruit into our forensic science laboratories? We want the best that we can get, but we won't get the best unless we give them the best. I should say that I strongly support many aspects of evidence-based, thoughtful criminal justice reform. There are good people out there trying to make our justice system more effective, and there's good people out there that want to see forensic science become more valuable and more impactful even than it already is. But when it comes to the standardization movement that has descended upon forensic science over the last decade or so, we would be kidding ourselves to believe that standardization is always a good thing. It is not always a good thing. There are situations where standards of practice have already been established through publications and peer review and literature and training and procedures and so on. Having worked in this field for over 30 years, I believe the time has come for leaders and innovators in forensic science to start asking tough questions about what we're doing and what matters most to us and how we want to spend our money and our time and our energy. But again, you know, if anyone out there still believes the completely fabricated idea that forensic science is a leading cause of wrongful convictions, then they are already coping with a bias that will compromise not only how they see forensic science, but how they see standardization. And they may be beyond helping. It is time for some overdue conversations that are honest, or to have some overdue, honest conversations by well-intentioned people. Conversations that are honest, that are unselfish, and are well-intentioned. You know, for years, some of the most prolific innocence activists or criminal justice reformers have criticized forensic techniques as not being scientifically valid. And they point to how clinical trials are performed in medicine as the standard. Well, here's an interesting bit of information in that regard. Did you know that there are very few, if any, ISO international standards governing exactly how a doctor or nurse must perform their clinical tasks, such as how to examine a patient, what medications to prescribe, and so on? And do you know why? It's because the proper treatment of patients requires professional expertise, professional autonomy, and professional judgment. And when you create barriers to that, you create two potentially catastrophic problems. The first is that you impair their ability to customize their work to the unique needs of their patients. And the second is that you remove the incentive for these doctors and nurses to develop and grow their expertise so that they can meet their responsibilities with greater reliability. It becomes dumbed down. Forensic science is no different. Each case is unique. Each piece of evidence is being tested for the very first time. Forensic science is an expertise-intensive occupation, and it needs to stay that way. And one of the reasons that there aren't international ISO standards governing how doctors and nurses directly interface with patients and treat them is because they do it in their own profession. It's established in their training and in their culture, in their peer-reviewed literature, and in their established procedures. They don't need international standardization for that because it already exists, just like it exists in forensic science. So we need to ask ourselves right now, what are we doing in forensic science? Why are we doing it? Who is it affecting, and how is it affecting them? Before I close this final episode of our 5th season here, and we're in November 2025, just shy of Thanksgiving, I have to tell you that I am beyond excited for what's coming in 2026. I wish I could tell you right now, but I can't. In May of next year, or what I can tell you is that in May of next year, I've been invited to deliver the opening keynote address at the Association of Firearm and Toolmark Examiners in Baltimore, Maryland. This is their annual educational conference, and it's going to feel like a homecoming for me. And I'm really looking forward to hopefully reconnecting with people who really influenced my early career in a very positive way and gave me a lot of mentorship and guidance when I desperately needed it. I want to thank the AFTI organizers for giving me that opportunity. And right after AFTI, I'll be heading over to the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors annual symposium, which is going to be in my home state of Michigan. And I'll be playing an active role, a speaking and teaching role, and I'll share more details soon about that, as these details are still kind of being put together and emerging. And there's going to be some other very exciting news that I hope to announce early next year, probably around the time that Valid Comparisons, my book, is released. I hope, and I'll keep you posted. I also want to, as we come to the end here, offer some words of encouragement to the many forensic laboratory scientists out there, especially those in the early stages of their careers who are still developing and finding their way, finding their footing. And of course, this also applies to seasoned professionals as well, who sometimes feel frustrated about where our profession appears to be headed, its priorities and its occasional unwillingness to speak truth to power or to hold accountable those who claim to want to improve or reform forensic science, but actually might not care a whole lot. Here is what I want you to know, and what I hope you will remember. You are working in an honorable field with honorable intentions and incredibly impressive capabilities. There are millions of people out there who would love to have your job. Be thankful that you get to work in a profession that allows you to be part of a community. You know, the older I get, the more I realize how many professionals out there in the workforce do not have that luxury. They cannot say that they are part of a community that is active and supportive and constantly striving to be better and serving as a steward of their occupation. You are part of a history of excellence and evolution that you can be proud of and that you should be proud of. Forensic science makes our criminal justice system more fair, more objective, more accurate, and more competent. And do not let anyone convince you otherwise. There will always be activists whose mission is to disparage you and your work. They will lie about you. They will say your work is invalid. They'll say it's junk science. It's not real science. They will dismiss your expertise. Some may even convince a judge or two that you shouldn't be allowed to testify. And from time to time, you'll run into courtroom science activists, as I describe in my book, who make the rounds, boasting their credentials and collecting consulting fees to portray you and your work as inadequate. So what should be your response to all of this? Your response should be, and should always be, to show up strong. Show up strong. Show up prepared. Wake up every morning committed to being the best forensic science professional that you can be. Feel good about your work and the people that you get to do it with, and go home at the end of each day knowing that your work somehow, somewhere helped protect the quality of someone's life, someone you will likely never meet. And if one day you become the director of a lab or a system of labs, or if you achieve a degree of influence that allows you to help perhaps shape the future of forensic science, I hope you'll have the integrity and courage to do what's right, to say what's true, to not reflexively cave into criticisms, or to lick your finger and put it up in the air and just follow the direction of the breeze. Even when those criticisms come from people in high-level positions of authority or intimidating individuals who are very articulate and sometimes very well funded, always be willing to ask the questions that need to be asked. In coaching, we learn that the future that we end up with usually begins with the answer to a question that someone was brave enough to ask at the right moment. Ask those questions and demand honest answers. And as far as the future is concerned, there are some things about forensic science that will never change. No matter what standards are published, what committees are formed, what testimony a judge excludes from a hearing, or what reports are issued by a government agency. Forensic science in its purest form exists to answer questions. Important questions. Profoundly difficult questions. How was my son killed? Was the driver drunk when he collided with my wife's car and sent her to the hospital? Who left a fingerprint on the doorknob of my home when it was ambushed in the middle of the night? What gun fired the bullet that killed my husband? Did the glass fragment at the scene of a fatal hit and run come from the suspect's vehicle? Forensic science has the privilege and the ability to answer some of the most monumental questions during the most difficult moments of a person's life. And one thing I know for sure, one thing I absolutely know for sure, is that you got into this profession because you wanted to answer those questions, just like I did. So the best encouragement I can give you is this: answer the questions and do it completely and honestly to the extent that your scientific credentials allow. Use your expertise to its fullest. Build your expertise. Do it with integrity. Don't let your confidence be broken by individuals who may sound convincing but might actually have an agenda and might not actually know what the heck they're talking about. And do not, under any circumstances, let this profession become something that no longer provides opportunities to be creative, to learn, to find meaning, or to experience satisfaction. You're not just a forensic scientist or a forensic science practitioner. You are a guardian of this profession, and it's counting on both of us to keep it an occupation that is valuable to the public and worth sacrificing for. Thanks again, everyone. As always, the opinions expressed on our show are those of your host, John Collins, that's me, and our guests, and should not be construed as representing the opinions of our sponsors, collaborators, or any other individuals or organizations with whom we may be affiliated. Just a quick reminder, as always, if you're interested in our world-class, on-demand, and very affordable training program for building your authoritative presence and conflict management skills, check out our Show Up Strong program at criticalvictories.com/showupstrong. And if you're looking for a powerful and convenient way to build the high resolution self-awareness that's necessary to be at your best, even when everything is on the line, check out my coaching page at criticalvictories.com/coaching. You can actually get started with a coaching program without any future obligation. And if I can help you, I would love to work with you or your team. Have a great end of your year, everyone. Happy Thanksgiving, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and let's all agree that we're going to be safe, we're going to be great, and we're going to stay committed to being a force for good and to protecting our quality of life from sea to shining sea by using expertise to enhance our pursuit of justice. Thanks again, everyone. We'll see you next year.